Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show.
So the water brushes I'm going to be using today are by a company called Superior, and the set's called Blooming Pen. I just found these on Amazon, and they come with 3 different sizes of flat and 3 different sizes of round brush. I'm going to be using 2 of the rounds and the large flat today. And if you haven't seen a water brush before, then basically what happens is you can unscrew the handle from the tip, and then you fill the handle up with water, and then each of the handles has a button which you can squeeze, and when you squeeze it you get more water flow out of the brush at the end here. So you can literally use this like a little pipette. You can squeeze this and water will drip out of the end of the brush there. In terms of paint, I'm going to be using my Winsor and Newton professional watercolors, alizarin crimson, French ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, cobalt blue and burnt umber. And I'm going to be using Rowney A2 mixed media paper. Finally, I've got a water spray bottle just in case I need that.
So the inspiration for today's painting are some sheep in the grounds of Powderham Castle. And sheep are one of the subjects that I paint a lot of.
Now when we're looking close up at some of the brushwork I've done for this particular painting, you can see there's a whole range of colours. Each mark is quite carefully considered, and you know, this is obviously in acrylic, so you've got quite vibrant colours and, you know, opaque, for the most part, opaque paint. So that's one of the paintings that was inspired by the flock at Powderham Castle.
So here's the reference photo that I'm going to use.
Now I did do a quick biro sketch just to position the 3 sheep, and then I moved the background sheep and lamb a little bit closer to the main group. Just I thought it made a better composition. And I've just outlined roughly where the cast shadows are. And that's just going to help me when I come to do the main painting.
So for the main painting, I've got my A2 paper taped down to my drawing board, and I want to do this with the absolute minimum of drawing and the absolute minimum of line work. So the acrylic painting I showed you before, as I mentioned, many of the brush strokes are carefully considered, the colours are bright and quite opaque. Here I want to exploit the looseness of watercolour. I really want to take things as far as I can in terms of loose mark making and just little patches of colour to create an impressionist style painting of these sheep and lambs. So with that in mind, what I've been doing while I've been chatting away there is I'm using one of the round brushes to very lightly in green. You can see I've just outlined the silhouettes of the animals. Next I've switched to the big flat, and I'm just giving a good squeeze right now to the water brush handle, and that's allowing water to flood out of the bristles and really allows me to kind of coat big areas of the paper with this lovely expressive wash. So this green is simply mixed up with the ultramarine blue, a little bit of the alizarin crimson, just a touch, and cadmium yellow. So when we're applying paint as watery as this, you're almost not painting, you're more sort of guiding the flood of water, guiding the edge of the puddle around the drawing that you've done. So you can see I've coated all the paper with that light green. And now it's not dry everywhere, but I don't mind too much about that. I've added a lot more of the ultramarine blue to the mix, and I'm beginning to indicate the darker cast shadows, these very long shadows that I had in the reference photo. And because I'm working wet into wet, I get those lovely blending effects that you can get with watercolour. And if a few cauliflowers form here and there, I don't mind at all. That's absolutely fine. So you can see I'm trying to stay very loose, but at the same time get right up close to the edge of my drawing keeping those animals completely pure white uncoated paper, because I'm taking a somewhat traditional approach. For this painting, I want the brightest of lights and whites to be the paper, the underlying paper. Switch to near pure ultramarine blue for that bottom right hand corner cast shadow, and again I'm just blending that in to the still wet green that's underlying it. So you can see already there's a sense of light beginning to appear, even though all we've done is put in a background and some cast shadows. Sticking with the flat brush, I've now mixed up a dark green again, and I just want to suggest some of the texture in the foreground. Working with watercolour in this way very much requires us to kind of stay in the moment, because we want to be able to respond very quickly to what the paint is doing, spontaneously. Now I've mixed up something close to a yellow ochre, so I've done that with mostly cadmium yellow, a little bit of the alizarin crimson, that will give me a nice orange, and then I just add a touch of the ultramarine blue, but not too much. And you can see I just used the round water brush, and I just kind of dropped, I mentioned how you can use the water brush as a pipette. I kind of just dropped little pools of this yellow ochre onto the sheet in regions of the animal which are in shadow. And now I'm just kind of mixing up and stirring up and manipulating the edges of those little pools of paint, or even using one pool of paint to act as a paint reservoir for another animal, just like I'm doing here. And I'm just kind of dappling the brush down, experimenting with the kind of textures I can get. But you can see I'm very much staying away from painting lines or painting shapes. So this style is very much in contrast to the style of the acrylic painting I showed you at the beginning of the video. I'm just lifting off a little bit with my fingertip there, because I want to maintain the shape of that lamb's head. So while I'm doing this process, what I'm doing is trying to be aware of the largest shapes of light and dark within the silhouette of the animal. And I'm trying to ensure that I keep the big light shapes completely untouched. Now you can probably see there's quite a lot of buckling in the paper that I'm using at the moment, but that will disappear when the paper dries out completely. It's a really good paper, this mixed media stuff. It doesn't buckle too much at all. Now while I was chatting, I just added a little touches of pure alizarin crimson into the still wet yellow ochre, and then I've allowed those little patches of the red to bleed out into the existing pool of paint. And now I'm doing exactly the same thing, little dots of pure cadmium yellow into the still wet paint, and I want to see what kind of effects I can get. So with this style of watercolour, I really am hoping the paint is going to do as much of the work for me as possible. And while those pools of paint are intermingling on the sheep and lambs, I'm coming in with a rather heavier mix of, it's just pure cadmium yellow actually, back to my big flat brush. And I just want to, deepen some of the colour in the foreground here for the grassy regions. Now the water brush, most of my experience of using it has been just when I'm out and about, fairly small sketches, and it's really convenient, really efficient way to carry your water, and you don't have to keep going back and forth to your water pot, of course. But what I'm finding here, working back at home on a bigger painting, is that there are still some advantages, because while I'm working away, kind of scumbling away here, I can just press the button if I want to loosen up a particular area, or I can not press the button if I want to keep the paint thick and opaque. So it's a really efficient way to be expressive as well. Next I'm coming in with some pure burnt umber, and if you look at the knees of sheep and lambs, they often have quite a dark area there, and also different areas of the head and the nose, perhaps the ear. So I'm still keeping things fairly light though. These are just kind of exploratory marks I'm making here. So for example, this eye I've just put down, that went into the wrong spot. So I just lifted that off with my finger. Try again, some indication of the eye, still not quite right. But if we're fairly delicate and tentative, if we're not, at times when we're not sure, then you can usually get away with it. You can see the paint is still a little bit damp, so I can just let some of this burnt umber bleed into certain areas of the still wet paint and begin to suggest shadows on this distant lamb as well. Now you see the way that little mark is kind of bled round the edge of the existing region of pigment. That's what I want. Yeah, that's lovely. It kind of just painted itself, the little underside of that belly. And that little bleeding of the burnt umber on this sheep here as well is doing something similar. So just by being very selective with the little dabs of paint we can make, we can use the wet in wet. And if we monitor it, stay in the moment, see what's happening, we can take advantage of little areas painting themselves. So still with the burnt umber, I'm just beginning to suggest some of the key deep shadows which appear sort of creases in the fleece, the rear legs which are in shadow under the belly. So we're working from light to dark for the most part. Obviously the cast shadows I put in on the lawn earlier were quite dark, but in general I'm working from light to dark. And so this burnt umber applied thinly is a good neutral mid-tone. Having established those neutral mid-tones, next I'm coming in with kind of a purple. So this is mostly ultramarine blue and a little touch of the alizarin crimson. And I'm using this for the darkest shadows, but you can see what's starting to happen there when I put the paint on between the front legs is it went down as quite a well-defined line. And in general I'm trying to avoid that. I want, obviously some of the preliminary lines that I put down right at the start of the painting, they are going to be visible partially, and I don't mind that. But on the whole, I want to avoid line work for this painting. So I'm being more careful now on the shadow region of the rear legs. So the lines I put down of shadow between the front legs of the sheep there have perhaps come out a little more defined than I would generally want for this painting. So let's try and make the next few marks a little softer. So the ear is a line, but it's softer. And if I squeeze the handle here, you can see I can run a nice defined line into a softer pool of more liquidy watercolor paint. So the eye is just a little mark to indicate the shadow that occurs there. I'll tentatively add a couple of similar marks to indicate the the lips and one of the nostrils, the jaw, the chin. Again, keeping things fairly soft. So the idea again is to pull the features out gradually from these apparently random patches of paint. So it's essentially an impressionist style of painting, isn't it? So here I put a little dot of paint on to indicate the eye of the lamb, but it went on too heavy. So I've just gradually lifted it off with repeated fingertip touches, and it's kind of smudged into something better than I hoped for, really, from that first mark. So that kind of works fairly well. Again, I'm trying to focus always on the large areas of shadow and the large areas of light. And in doing that, letting the textures and the intermixing of colours hopefully will happen fairly automatically. Important to step back fairly regularly to see how things are working, especially with this style of painting, but that's an important thing to do in general. And again, a few selective shadows on both of the lambs. A little touch of line work there. It's difficult to completely resist it, but on the whole, I'm succeeding in keeping the line work very, very minimal. So the water brush is surprisingly expressive, actually. When you look at the bristles on the brush, they're synthetic, and for the size of brush there aren't too many of them, and I imagine that is to ensure a nice, even and plentiful flow of water when you press the button on the handle. But the lack of finesse in the bristles seems to be countered by the ability to just let the water flow. So it's, I enjoy using them. It's a good little implement to experiment with. So I'm coming in here with some pure ultramarine blue. So when we look at shadow areas, it's important to remember that although they are often very dark, there are nearly always multiple colours within a shadowy region, especially on something like a sheep, where you've got a textured surface, and it'll be picking up, even in the shadow areas, it'll be picking up reflected hues from lots of different things. So the light will be bouncing off of the grass onto the shadowed region of the rear legs, but it will also be bouncing off of the little lamb onto the shadow region as well. So you've got all of these diffuse scatterers, all of these diffuse light scatterers around the animals, and the sheep's wool will also scatter light diffusely as well. So you can look for those colours, you can enhance them if you want to, and you can even kind of play around and put some colours in which aren't there, and providing you keep the tone pretty dark, you'll probably get away with it. And it generally makes for a much more interesting shadow than if you just block in a dark brown, for example. So again, if the paint goes on too heavy, lift it off with a paper towel or a fingertip. The beauty of watercolour is you don't have to worry about, acrylic can sometimes be a struggle to wash off your hands once it's fully dry. And certainly acrylic, if it gets on your clothes, well, I think that's more or less permanent, but watercolour is not such a big problem. So I'm just being quite careful there, because you've got to define, although we want things to be really loose, we still have to define our key shapes quite precisely. Otherwise, the patches of colour won't read as a selection of real animals. It'll just read as a selection of patches of colour. So while I want things to be somewhat abstract, I don't want them to be so abstract that people question, Is that a sheep? Is that a lamb? Perhaps that would be an interesting thing to do, actually, just to push it a little further. But for this painting, I want people to look and go, oh, there are sheep and lambs there. And then on closer inspection, maybe they think, well, hang on, there's hardly any drawing here. These are just, this is just patches of colour. So again, with the cast shadows, I'm now going back in with the blue, and those cast shadows have dried, but within them, I can darken certain regions, so we get lights and darks within those cast shadows. So squinting at your subject or at your reference photo is a really good trick. Putting the reference photo across the other side of the room so that you're looking at it from a distance, it's a really good way to stop being lured into the trap of painting too much detail. And it forces you to only be able to see the large shapes of light and dark. Now, with this particular style of watercolour painting, where I'm relying on the unpainted paper to give me the lightest areas, if you want those areas to look very light, then you need to put something dark next to it. So you can see on the left-hand side of the lamb where I'm working now, the first mark I put down, I didn't really like what I did, so I lifted it off. So I'm trying now to keep it dark, but soften that region of shadow. See, that's worked a little bit better now, I think. Just going back to the distant lamb and sheep to darken some of the cast shadows. And again, we're keeping in mind, even though, really I've just got the animals here, I don't have any distant hills or anything, I am deliberately keeping things softer and less detailed on the distant lamb and sheep compared to the group of three in the foreground. A little spritz with the water bottle there, with the water spray I should say. Just wanted to lift off that shadow region and soften some of the cast shadows. And I've mixed up a yellowy green now, so this is the cadmium yellow and a little touch of the ultramarine blue. And what I was doing on the left of the picture was just a quick test. I mixed this colour up because I wanted to use that on the left of this foreground lamb rather than the blue that I'd experimented with before. But I want to make sure that region is somewhat soft. So another spray with the water sprayer, and I'll just let that do its own thing. And I'll do the same thing with that patch of green I put on the left and move it around a bit with the water brush as well. And then lift off not the whole region, but just little touches within the patch of colour. Similar treatment on that central lamb, just to keep three patches of that green reasonably evenly distributed across the foreground. So look how loose this painting is once dry, but hopefully as we pull back, those patches of colour cohere into 5 animals, 2 sheep, 3 lambs, spring with the flock. Hope you enjoyed this experiment with the water brush. Thanks very much for watching. As always, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.